o'clock, the government will have a poster presentation, and then at 5:30, the public testimony will start, and that will end at 8 p.m. And you do not have to pre-register to testify, but you do have to sign up when you get there. And each person has 3 minutes to speak, and that's about equal to about 400 words. It's not very much. And do not hesitate to speak out. People have been protesting nuclear weapons for decades. And that is the only way we're ever going to get rid of them. Because the other side wants to keep doing them more and more and more. All of our comments will be recorded, and the government must respond to them. And I'll go to the next slide. So you may also email, you can speak there, and then also email, fax, or snail mail your comments or questions into the government. And the address to send them to if you email is PEIS, PEIS, @nsa.doe.gov. And the deadline for getting those comments in is July 16th. And you can refer to the website PEIS.com for full information on all the information that you need. And all comments that are submitted will be equally considered. But one caveat, it's best to use your own words, because if you copy and paste from suggested comments too much, your contribution might be lumped together with similar comments and only counted as one comment. So we don't want to do that. Tonight, we will hear a brief introduction from me, and then a short presentation from Bryson Ripley from VETS local chapter of Vets for Peace on how nuclear weapons fit into the U.S. empire and its war making. So give a little context. And then we have two very knowledgeable national speakers here. We're so honored to have them. Dr. Janice Forte from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They are an environmental toxicologist, and I'll introduce her more in depth later. And Jay Coughlin, and he is the Executive Director of Nuke Watch, New Mexico. There will be time for questions and answers until 8:30 p.m. because they told us they want us all out of here by 8:45, darn it. So you can come up to the microphone and ask your questions. So for the star of the show, we are going to talk about plutonium a little bit. Plutonium is a highly poisonous radioactive substance that is created from splitting your highly enriched uranium in a nuclear reactor. The half-life of plutonium-239, the isotope that is used in nuclear weapons, is 24,100 years. So that means it is going to be deadly and dangerous for a total of 240,000 years. A plutonium pit is the core or trigger of a thermonuclear weapon and is called the primary. A plutonium pit is a hollow sphere with tritium in the center to boost the explosion, and tritium is also radioactive. There is a very hard and toxic substance called beryllium surrounding the plutonium. Then regular explosives are placed around the plutonium pit that will compress it to make it reach criticality. And that means its atoms start splitting, which is called fission. And this releases a huge amount of energy. It also produces X-rays that penetrate the secondary, which is the uranium part of the bomb. So that's that blue part. And this causes fusion, where atoms add on subatomic particles, and fuse together. This releases enormous amounts of energy. That's like the sun. That's what the sun does. A modern nuclear bomb is massively bigger than the ones that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was destroyed by a single small uranium bomb, and Nagasaki by just a tiny plutonium bomb. And look what it did, just flattened the entire city, killed thousands and thousands of people. Next slide. And this is just some examples of bombs that Kansas City is involved in making parts for. We make 100,000 parts a year at our Kansas City plant. So the W80-4, we're doing a so-called life extension program. It's not to extend our lives, but the bomb. And it would be dropped from an airplane. And the W87 is on an ICBM, those big missiles that are underground, that are stationary. So, just to kind of give you an example, we really are involved with nuclear weapons. So, a successful lawsuit by environmental groups is why we're here tonight. We forced the DOE, which is the Department of Energy, and its super secret, semi-autonomous agency, NNSA, which stands for the National Nuclear Security Administration, to produce a programmatic environmental impact statement, which is a PEIS. That's where we get that acronym. So this is for both Los Alamos Lab, which is located in New Mexico, and also the proposed Plutonium Pit Processing Facility at SRS, and that stands for Savannah Riverside, and that is located near Aiken, South Carolina. The government wants to repurpose a huge, brand new building there to make plutonium pits. So this new building is something that they're having to just totally reconfigure and remodel to do this plutonium pit work, which is something SRS has never done before. And it is $30 billion plus that pit production facility will be the most expensive building in U.S. history. So just big waste of money. So tomorrow we have a rare historic opportunity to oppose making new nuclear weapons parts here in Kansas City. Kansas City is home to one of the 8 major sites that together make U.S. nuclear weapons. We're very integral, very vital to making nuclear weapons work. We make the parts that guide it and set it off. There would be no nuclear weapons without us. We make 80% of the mechanical and electrical parts for nuclear weapons. So the in-person hearings were mandated for 5 sites, and those are the sites that are going to work on the new plutonium pits through this settlement from the lawsuit that we won against the government under the NEPA environmental law, which is the National Environmental Protection Act. And just by the way, the current administration is trying to get rid of that act. What could go wrong? The government made plans to produce 80 or more plutonium pits per year for 50 years. But they did not consider community input on our health and our environmental safety, which is required by law. So just wanted to put a graphic up there to show you how much money is being wasted on nuclear weapons already. And every year it goes up. And this year it went up a huge amount. So this is something that our watchdog groups keep an eye on, keep track on. Whenever the budget comes out, we scrutinize it. So the previous plant that made plutonium pits for the U.S. was called Rocky Flats. It was located just outside of Denver, Colorado. It was shut down in 1989 by an FBI raid, can you imagine, for environmental crimes. It was incinerating plutonium and venting it directly into the air. Most of this hugely contaminated plant was buried on the site, but wind in the area, which is near the mountains, carries around tiny particles of plutonium, which if you inhale them, they can cause cancer. So since the Cold War ended about that time, only up to 30 new pits have been made at Los Alamos, New Mexico, until now. So the return to making lots of plutonium pits means a restart of the nuclear arms race. That means nuclear weapons forever. This is our chance to stop triggers for new nuclear weapons, which can lead to nothing but death and destruction. We all know even a limited nuclear war would lock soot from burning cities into the stratosphere, and that's where rain and all that doesn't even touch it. And it would circle the earth, would block sunlight for years, leading to worldwide crop failures and mass starvation. And an all-out global nuclear war would plunge us into a brutal ice age, and the living would actually envy the dead. So this is our chance to say no to this insanity. So now we'll hear from Bryson Ripley from Vets for Peace. Thank you.
I served in the Marine Corps from 2014 to 2019 as a corrections specialist. So I didn't deploy anywhere, I didn't go into combat, although my job was dangerous. I did not do what most people go into the military for. And I usually like to start off by saying that I've gone through a pretty long ideological journey from pre-military, being an American exceptionalist, believing the things that they teach you in American public schools, to post-military, learning about the actual history of our country and all of the very horrible things we've done. So I'm no expert. I'm really just a guy that is going to college, trying to learn and trying to help his community in his world. So with that, we'll start. Nuclear weapons. Why, right? So this is Major General Smedley Butler. He was a general that served in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He's very famous as an American figure for many different reasons. But the reason why we like him in Veterans for Peace so much is he wrote this book called War is a Racket, where he explains from his perspective, from what he saw in the military, why our wars are not about protecting our country. They're not about taking freedom to the rest of the world. They're really about resources and upholding, keeping the U.S. empire in place. So war, this is the first part of his book. War is a racket. It always has been. It's possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is only one international in scope. It's the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, which is Smedley Butler talking in the book, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people, us. Only a small inside group knows what it's about. It's conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make fortunes. So they're making money off of war. Why do we need nuclear weapons? Well, it has a lot to do with why we need war. The cold power. It's all about profit and greed. The military-industrial complex and corporations make money while we suffer, and they're fueling this cycle of war. The United States, they need these nuclear weapons that we're told that we need these nuclear weapons through different propaganda systems that are beholden to these corporations and this military-industrial complex. And they end up really just being a tool for our empire, for American imperialism. So I have a few pictures that I think will kind of help demonstrate. I pulled this picture off of a website for miniatures, tabletop gaming. I don't know if anyone's into that, but when it comes to trusting things, I usually trust nerds and tabletop gamers like myself. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend going to that one, but I did verify that. This is of the height of the Roman Empire. And if you really want to get a sense of what an empire is, you look at where the military is. So at the height of the empire, this is basically everywhere they had. Funniest part about that website too, they talk about how Britannia needed 3 military bases, and they comment, I wonder if it's because of the Irish. And they say, yeah, Africa and Spain only needed 1, and I was like, wait a minute, I don't think these people realize that Egypt is a part of Africa too, so maybe I shouldn't have been. But now I did verify it. So where's our bases, right? How many U.S. military bases are there compared to the rest of the world? Well, 861 bases in 95 countries, that's the U.S. This is per World Beyond War. So it is generally accurate. It may be give or take a few military bases, and obviously that's not counting the black sites and sites that they don't actually tell us about. Obviously, the UK, the previous reigning champ of imperialist colonial power, they've got 118, Russia 35, Turkey 131, China. We talk a lot about China nowadays and how dangerous they are, but weird they only have 6 bases in 6 countries. France, I was also very surprised with that, considering how tied they are to imperialist colonial projects in Africa, especially currently, if you're not following what's going on in Mali and different places, Burkina Faso. And then, of course, Israel 14. I thought it was also interesting Japan had 1, considering their history as imperialist power. And then, of course, I just had to have a map of U.S. military bases, right? This is kind of a global look of where we have ours. So, 800, that's like, I don't know, 10 times every other country in the world. Multiple countries combined aren't even comparing to what's going on with our military power. So it's absolutely mind-boggling, which is why I don't really believe anymore when we're talking about why we're going to war, why we're sitting our military places like Iran, because if it's always been before now about imperial resource extraction, then I'm very sure now it's probably the exact same thing. And then of course I added this map of nuclear sites across the world, not just the U.S. This is the Federation of American Scientists. Also, probably very out of date, considering it is from 2009, but I kept it for time purposes because I'm going to call it right now. So, but 2009, interesting. That's when Obama, his administration came out with information about how Iran is starting this nuclear program. Of course, we were talking about Iran's nuclear program 10 years before that. And of course, now, what are we talking about? Of course, they don't have any design or production in Iran on this one. But it is a little old, so no. But I really wanted everyone to see this one specifically because of these areas. We talk about nuclear sites, and we usually ignore the fact that many countries have nuclear submarines carrying nuclear weapons ready to deploy at any moment. So it's just absolutely terrifying. But of course, all this comes back to manufacturing consent. Why do we need nuclear weapons? Well, we know they're a tool of empire, of American imperialism. So the same, military propaganda campaigns and psyops that are going on for our U.S. military, it's the same thing going on to manufacture consent for new nuclear weapons, nuclear production in general. So keep that in mind when you're watching whatever particular resource you watch. But what's it all about? It's about protecting that racket, right? And that's what we need to oppose. So if you're anti-nuclear weapons, you should be anti-war, and you should be anti-American empire. Smedley Butler, his suggestion was take all of those military bases, right? All those bases, and just put them right here, where we live, because that's the only place they need to be. So that's all I got. And thank you so much for having me. Appreciate you all.
And Miranda reminded me that on my last slide, I should have explained that those were pictures from PeaceWorks and other groups that come here to protest at our nuclear bomb plant. So that's what those were about. We've had about over 200 arrests out there for trespass to show our disapproval. So I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. C.A. Forte. She is a scientist for the Union of Concerned Scientists in the Global Security Program, specializing in environmental toxicology and epidemiology. Their work with the UCS focuses on the health and well-being of communities affected by nuclear weapon mining, exposure, and the threat of exposure. Prior to this, they also worked at the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps as a deployment health epidemiologist researching active service member deployability and the environmental impacts of the U.S. Norfolk Naval Hospital. Dr. Forte has a PhD in environmental health sciences and a second PhD in scientific computing from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Prior to pursuing their doctorate, they earned a master's degree in public health from the University of Georgia with a focus on epidemiology and biostatistics. Please welcome Dr. Forte.
Yes, that is my name. Also, if you're wondering why there's Sharpays in my intro and last slide, is because when I just Google PEIS, I get a bunch of Sharpay images, and it made me very happy. And since this is a sad topic, we may as well enjoy cute, adorable puppies at the beginning and end. And so, just to sort of give you a background on what an environmental impact statement is supposed to have in it, right? So it is a federally mandated requirement, and these are supposed to regularly happen, right, before any activity starts, which is why it's so appalling that the community had to sue and organizations had to sue to be able to, actually get this programmatic environmental impact statement. And so there's two forms of these environmental impact statements. There's a site-wide environmental impact statement, which every single federal location that has activity that could affect the environment and surrounding community has to complete. So there is one specifically on the Kansas City plant and their operations, right? And then there's programmatic environmental impact statements. And a programmatic environmental impact statement is saying that specifically for any of the activities related to this program or project, these are all of the possible risks to the environment and surrounding community. And so this is where the pit production program comes into play, right? And so this PEIS should be including information specific to each of those 8 sites that will clarify for us sort of what is the increased risk directly related to pit production, right? And not to bury the lead, that doesn't happen for the Kansas City location specifically in this PEIS, and that's a problem. We'll talk about that more. Again, these should also address all of the risk, and most importantly, and I think this is a note that I kind of keep reiterating myself as someone who has been in statistics and sort of scientific computing and understanding regulatory standards, is that currently where we find ourselves, our federal agencies are not using the best science or best known practices for developing regulatory standards or for creating these sort of reports. And that should be a concern for us, right? So there's the legal requirements of these environmental impact statements, but there is also the onus to do good work, right? What is the point of making a report if you're not going to do it correctly? Now, the Kansas City National Security Campus, based on so when the Kansas City plant moved locations, they went back and were able to sample the area and discover sort of what was being used there. And based on that, there were over 2,400 toxic chemicals and materials used as of 2016, right? And you can see this long, exhaustive list of the different things that are there. I don't have all of my notes, I apologize. But I will say there's a lot of chemicals that should be of concern. Dicot is included in that, which is an extremely harmful herbicide. I actually started my work in chemistry and chemical exposures, and so I moved from the pesticide industry actually to nuclear weapons about a half a decade ago, so I was really interested in that section. But there's also things like toluene, benzene, there's volatile organic compounds, there's PCBs, BPA, and many other very harmful materials that we should be concerned about, including lead and other heavy metals that are known to affect the human brain and growth. So I want to clarify that thinking about the growth part, right, we're mostly thinking about children and people who are newly born, right? But these things can affect you over the lifetime. And additionally, they are not tracked to have, is this working? Maybe not. That's okay. They're not tracked to be using radioactive materials in this plutonium pit program. That's why they're sort of using that as a loophole to say, well, we don't need to report the direct harms to the community in Kansas City because they're not going to be working with anything too hazardous or new anyway. Don't worry about it. We're not willing to accept that. Part of transparency and telling the full story of an environmental impact statement is telling the full story. And therefore, we are demanding that they do, in fact, tell the full story and tell us precisely how will this increased production of plutonium pits and even, yes, the non-radioactive components of it in Kansas City will affect the environment and people. And so there's a lot of different hazards that you can experience in a workplace. We've got some fun images here, especially when we were talking about electrical components, and I found this stock image, I just had to include it. But it's important to understand that accidents can happen in and along transportation routes, which of course all of these things are going to have to be transported, most likely to the south, most likely to Texas at the Pantex location, to actually assemble the weapons together, right? So you've got more trucks on the highway, which are traveling, commercial vehicles traveling with your own car, so it's more and more wear and tear on the roads and everything like that, and all of those are costs to the people of Kansas City. You have to understand that there's lots of debris and pollution, right? So since 2024, the Kansas City plant has gotten a large grant to expand, and I believe Jay, the person speaking after me, will talk to this a little bit more. But they got a very large grant to expand, so they're almost doubling in size. And again, we need to understand and have the right to know, is this related to the plutonium pit project? And also, even if it's not, what is this expansion and all of the dust and pollutants, in the air that is kicking up, how do those affect people's health in addition to whatever increased risk the plutonium pit project could create? And so you have to remember as well, when you're working with large machinery and things, you can be crushed. You can get cuts like lacerations or scrape up against things, get abrasions. So physical injuries are still very important. Everyday workplace injuries like ergonomics and so on are also still important. And when we look at workers, so workers from the Kansas City plant have been sort of complaining for years now that they're having health harms and they're having health effects, and they keep being told, well, you shouldn't have any health harms, it's not radioactive materials, you're essentially being delusional. And as someone in public health who has worked in government and nonprofit and academia and pharmaceutical and all sorts of fields related to human health, I never disbelieve people when they come forward and tell me they're hurting. That's the first point of doing public health, is that I'm not an expert on your area, I'm not an expert on your body, you are, and therefore you're the one to tell me that. Many of these people, out of 117 reports, 60 of these people reported cancers. There were reports of thyroid disease, there were goiters, there was reports of tumor disorders, both benign and malignant, from these workers, right? So out of 117, we know 60 were cancer. That's a very large amount, that's over half. So clearly there's something radioactive happening. And when you look at that list of 2,400 toxicants at that location, you do see radioactive materials, including uranium, in that report. And so it's important to understand that. And then of course, talking about beryllium, berylliosis, which is a very harmful disease that causes inflammation of the lungs. It can result in scarring of the lungs, as well as lung cancer. And so these are very important to discuss. And it's also important to understand that there are non-radioactive chemicals that can also cause an increase in cancer, such as benzene, which I mentioned earlier. But the list does go on, and if in questions we really want to get into the nitty-gritty, I am so happy to. That is my jam. And so, as I mentioned, the Kansas City plant was not actually included in this programmatic environmental impact statement. However, we can pull some reporting or ideas, as I've been talking about, from the site-wide environmental impact statement that was released some years ago, as well as the site exposure matrices. That's the report of 2,400 toxicants I keep talking about. And a toxicant, if you're like, that's a new word for me, it's literally any toxic material put in the environment by a human source. So all of these things we are talking about are man-made. We don't have a need for nuclear weapons. I think the two folks who spoke before me made a very good case. And so again, why are we increasing toxicants in our environment? And so, as I mentioned, they make the non-radioactive components, and that radioactive materials are not slated to necessarily be produced or handled or shipped through Kansas City according to the PEIS, but that does not absolve them from giving a more detailed and completing the actual statistical risk assessment of what will harm folks in the environment and living in the area. And again, as I mentioned before, there are many common industrial chemicals, including diesel fuel exhaustion. I think I named all of these. A lot of solvents, paints, and strippers, like solvents that strip paint as well. And then, of course, again, in that same list of 2,400 materials, of course, you see beryllium, tritium, both gas and tritiated water, and uranium as well, all of which are considered carcinogen. Well, except, beryllium, but all of which do harm the human body. Beryllium mostly harms through its chemical properties. And so, as I mentioned before, I of course am an expert on science and mathematics, and I very much love that. I understand the human body at the cellular level, all the way up to understanding how communities connect with each other and build power to fight against institutions. But I am not from Kansas City. I've never lived in Kansas City. I came on the 5th and have eaten at least a third of my body weight in barbecue. The rumors are very true. Thank you. But especially, and I put in here a brief discussion. I didn't know much about the venue and things, so I'll keep this sort of short. But I'll say, when you come to the podium, even if you don't have a question or something, and you're just like, hey, my family member had this happen, or this happened, or my neighbor, or something I know, feel free to share that if you're comfortable, or to come up to me after we're done talking and chat a little bit. I'm happy to answer whatever sort of things have been beating around your mind. If I don't know the answer, I will happily get back to you and look it up, and I can send that information to PeaceWorks Kansas City for you. Or you can take my info, either one. Here, these are the the main talking points that as an organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, are interested in discussing. The colors are completely arbitrary. I just wanted to add a little spice. So there's actually no evidence of us needing to create new plutonium pits. So the argument that the NNSA is making is that, well, the current plutonium pits that we have in our nuclear weapon arsenal are aging, and therefore we should just make all new pits and stuff those in the nuclear weapons. Now, when you actually do a literature review, like my colleague Dr. Dylan Spalding did, and you look across the literature and you read, you find out that most of the research shows you can actually reuse pits, that pits last a lot longer than they're claiming in their report, and so on and so forth. And so it's very important for us to understand that not only are nuclear weapons altogether unnecessary, but these new plutonium pits are very unnecessary and are also going to most likely, as Ann said, be put into these new nuclear weapon models, but they're not saying that per se. There's not clear transparency, and that is also a problem. So these pits, I just said that, I'm sorry, y'all. I got caught up in the colors. So PEIS must also precede federal actions. And this is so important. Yes, we already sued once, but this is important because far before the federal government approves a budget, approves how they'll handle things, they are supposed to get public feedback and public commentary. And that is a legal requirement that's not different for anyone. And that did not happen in this situation. We are now years into producing plutonium pits. Jay will go into all of the costs in great detail, but I mean, we're talking over $10 billion already spent, and you've gotten not a single person's feedback from the community, and that's a problem. And then, some of these get really detailed, I'm sorry. And then the activity, yeah, I said all of this. Okay, I'm sorry, y'all. I didn't have my notes. I was assuming I'd be on a computer. And then this is my second to last slide, and then my last slide. Essentially, one of the things that I worked on a lot in my work is understanding the full exposures everyone gets in their environment. So out of everything happening, I mean, I'm talking your household cleaners, the pesticides sprayed outside, the exhaust fumes outside, the big factory down the road, all of these things, in my computational engineering nerddom, am learning to calculate all together, right? Which is actually very new for toxicology. We called it mixed chemicals and mixed methods research. And this is something that a lot of countries like Canada, like the UK, they're already incorporating into their regulatory science requirements. Now, specific to this PEIS, as part of their lawsuit, they're actually required to include this cumulative impact information, and they're not doing that. So that's also a concern that I'll be addressing in my statement. And so, as I mentioned, it already fails to mention the impacts to multiple locations, starting with the Kansas City plant, and that this entire study needs to also consider special, how do I say this in plainer terms? Certain conditions that are people who are more vulnerable to these exposures. So that can be people like children or women because they're more radiosensitive, or they have less of sort of all of the bodily functions to kick out toxins as much, specifically talking about children, and they're still, growing and building their body as a cleaning system. This can include folks who are low income, who don't have access to good health care, who don't have access to proper transportation and things like that to be able to go get help if they are concerned. This also includes a lot of our indigenous and rural communities. Rural communities are often overlooked by the federal government and by the U.S. American health system, but especially when we think about indigenous and communities and people living on sovereign indigenous nations, we have to also keep in mind that nuclear weapons and nuclear colonialism is very well and alive in the United States. After all, we think it's okay to maintain over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation land. Again, that's not our nation. That is a sovereign nation, and we have no right to be there. Again, they are measuring all of the risk from the center based on a completely arbitrary 50-mile radius, which became a regulatory science standard in the early 60s and has not really changed, even though we know there is better science. What does that mean? That means they draw a circle 50-mile radius outside of the location, and they determine what in that will be a risk. They don't consider per se things traveling down the wind or downriver. They don't consider things that are nearby. So if your city isn't in that 50-mile radius, you're not included. But if you're 50.5 miles away, you might want to be included. So these are sort of the things that I'm talking about that are really nuanced details in their assessment that don't make sense. And again, talking about straying from best standards, they also stray away from the worst case scenario, which says if something bad happens, this is the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen. And you plan for the worst case scenario, and you do your risk assessment for the worst case scenario, because that way, if anything that's not the worst case, you're very prepared for it. However, in this PEIS, they're talking about the most likely thing to happen, which, of course, it's unlikely for something major to happen. We have lots of safety regulations and rules, and people are trained and so on and so forth. However, to err is human, and things happen, right? Even when it's not a human's problem or fault. Yeah. And this is essentially just a summary of everything I just said. I want to go ahead and give it back to Anne so she can present the next speaker. I appreciate y'all's time, and thank you for your service.
That was excellent. I'm being a nurse. I'm just so fascinated. So, Jay Coughlin is executive director of Nuclear Watch New Mexico, a nonprofit organization that watchdogs the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the Department of Energy's nationwide nuclear weapons complex. He has worked successfully against radioactive incineration at the Los Alamos Lab and in Clean Air Act, Freedom of Information Act, and National Environmental Policy Act lawsuits against the Department of Energy. Among other things, he prompted a 2006 independent study that concluded that plutonium pits, the fissile triggers of nuclear weapons, last at least a century, leading to congressional rejections of new design nuclear weapons and their production. He is now centrally engaged in fighting against the U.S. government's most recent and serious attempt to expand plutonium pit production, the choke point of resumed U.S. industrial production of nuclear weapons. He has also served as a consultant on nuclear disarmament issues to the Santa Fe Archdiocese for the last 6 years. And I met Jay for the first time in 2006, I believe, when he came to Kansas City to warn us that the Kansas City plant was going to be torn down and that they're going to build a new nuclear production facility, the first in the U.S. in 32 years. And he asked for a volunteer to lead that effort, and my best friend volunteered, Donna Constantino. And 8 months later, she said, "I'm burnt out, can you take over?" And I was like, "Okay, but you better help me." So one of the things that Jay taught me, his mantra is, sue early and sue often.
Ann and I are pretty good friends. It's been a little bit. So let's see. There we go. I'm Jay, based in Santa Fe. And my organization is one of the plaintiffs that engaged in this lawsuit. So a brief history of it. This is something I'd like to stress. This has been a long fight. It's not over. It won't be over next year. It's going to go on for decades. But it started in 1990. And at that time, the Natural Resources Defense Council got a court order requiring DOE to complete a programmatic environmental impact statement on its post-Cold War nuclear weapons complex, and DOE just ignored it. It was a court order from a federal judge in D.C. DOE just ignored it. So in a separate lawsuit, we finally got DOE to agree to a stockpile stewardship and management, PEIS, and that's kind of the mother PEIS. This one is technically a supplement to that PEIS back in 1996. And then something I really like to stress, the public doesn't know this, that since that time, since basically the year 2000, the National Nuclear Security Administration, that's when NNSA came into being, by the way, was the year 2000. But NNSA tried 4 times to expand pit production through various processes under the National Environmental Policy Act, and we beat them 4 times. And it should be obvious why I want people to know that, is we've been successful in the past. Now, I'm never one to sugarcoat things. This 5th time is by far the most serious, the most difficult, and they are throwing tens of billions of dollars into it. So finally, in 2018, NNSA announced the 2-site strategy involving the Los Alamos Lab and the Savannah Riverside. And yesterday evening, I was at the hearing for Savannah Riverside in North Augusta, South Carolina. And I got to tell you, they were surprisingly strong. So I'm challenging Kansas City, to be as good as the folks in South Carolina. So they were surprisingly strong in their comments. And then, so they're going to do this, relying upon, and they, being the NNSA, they were going to rely upon an old 2008 programmatic environmental impact statement that did not analyze simultaneous production at 2 sites. And, NNSA and the government in general, they're going to get away with anything that you let them get away with. And actually, Ann said that I say sue early and sue often. That was actually a congressman from California, Pete Stark, and a Republican congressman in the late 1980s that used to say that because of the Livermore lab. So, but I'm with Pete Stark. Sue often and sue early. So finally, in June 2021, we sued, and a federal judge in South Carolina ruled in our favor in September 2024. Now, Ann indicated that we first met in 2006. That's probably about right. And I was becoming aware of, basically, you have to understand that at that time it was still, not that long after the end of the Cold War, and even Congress was seriously discussing possibly shrinking the U.S. nuclear weapons complex. And that's why I have subtitled this, The Big Fish That Got Away. So basically, the folks here and NNSA, I'm going to say conspired to essentially defraud the American taxpayer to avoid congressional appropriations and to avoid congressional scrutiny and to come up with alternative financing that had no upfront costs to the American taxpayer, but had bigger costs down the road. So, and this really galled me back at the time, that the municipal government of Kansas City, Missouri, declared 180 acres producing soybeans. They declared that to be urban blight.
Dirty rats.
And using Missouri state tax codes to address urban blight, cooked up this financial scheme with NNSA that it was Zimmer Centerpoint that was lead contractor, so they built it at their expense, but they had a guaranteed income in that NNSA was going to lease it in forever. So I emphasize again, this was a scheme to avoid congressional scrutiny, to avoid the standard congressional appropriations process, and to keep the Kansas City plant alive when, oh man, I so much wanted to knock off one of the 8 NNSA sites. And why that's so important is because, you know, you always have congressional delegations after the nuclear pork. And in this particular case, we could have divested both the congressional delegations of Missouri and Kansas, you know. So it was the fish that got away. And as a result, the new Kansas City National Security Complex is now cranking out more than 100,000 non-nuclear components for nuclear weapons every year. And then they're looking at a massive expansion as we speak. So again, the fish that got away. Now, concerning Kansas City plant and PIP production. Now, obviously, the Kansas City National Security Complex does a lot of things, but PIP production is big and growing. And the draft programmatic environmental impact statement is deeply, deeply flawed for a number of reasons. And, you know, I'm somewhat careful with my words, so I'll say that they're highly misleading instead of just lying. But as you can see, they explicitly say, first, that operations at KCNSC, and the ellipse there, the 3 dots there, I put that there because it mentions like 4 other sites. But it does say operations at Kansas City are not directly involved in PIP production activities. That is false. That is very much false. Now, to be clear, it's not involved in any plutonium that I'm aware of. And what it does is PIT, so that's in quotes, PIT support, but support is literal. They're doing things that, you know, keep the plutonium PIT core fixed where it should be within the warhead. But they're also supplying mechanical and electrical devices, you know. Again, all non-nuclear. But for them to say that Kansas City is not involved in, you know, for one thing, I've showed Ann to go to what's called the laboratory tables. This is a DOE budget document. And it breaks down all the programs by subcategories. You can go to Kansas City and you can see money appropriated for PIP production. So for the PEIS to say, you know, Kansas City is not involved in PIP production, that's a falsehood, among many others in the PEIS. So here I briefly explain, you know, what Kansas City is up to, and then ultimately these components, they're getting shipped to Los Alamos now, because Los Alamos is beginning to produce PITs. And then in the future, they'll be shipped to the Savannah River site for PIT production. And then both sites end up shipping the PITs to the Pantex plant near Amarillo for final assembly of the nuclear weapons. What's the deal? Here we go. Okay, now to get to specific talking points. I say for both oral and written comments, but something that I want to stress is, you know, you're given only 3 minutes in your oral comments at the hearing tomorrow. And it's difficult to, you know, say that much of substance. And then, you know, I've been doing this for 3 decades or something, and I kind of regard these oral hearings as a bit of kabuki theater or whatever. And, you know, both sides are posturing and trying to get media stories, all of which is important. I don't want to denigrate that. But what I am doing is emphasizing the need for written comments. And I go nuts. I submit 60 to 70 page detailed comments. But, you know, I urge you to submit original, somewhat detailed, somewhat comprehensive comments. And one reason, there's method in my madness. I started out pointing out that, you know, the lawsuit that I've been engaged in for the last 8 years is actually a 3rd generation lawsuit. And if I can get away with it, there'll be a 4th generation lawsuit. But you've got to build the administrative record, and it takes the submittal of detailed, comprehensive comments to do that. And also, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a wannabe lawyer. Okay, I guess I don't know what I did, but continuing with, talking points. If I have any single take-home point that I want to get across, it is this: zero future pit production. Zero. I like to emphasize it. Nada. Zilch. Zero. Pit production is to maintain the safety and reliability of the existing stockpile. And ask me, why is that? Well, I'm glad you asked. The stockpile doesn't need it. The isotope of plutonium-239 used in nuclear weapons, first of all, it has a half-life. It's long. It's 24,000 years. That makes it pretty stable. That's a relative term for a radioactive isotope. That makes it fairly stable. I very much urge you to read Chalice's colleague's report, Dylan Spalding, who has an excellent chapter on plutonium aging. So I'm not going to go into details, but not only is plutonium-239 relatively stable, it has self-healing properties. This is very important. And there are some scientists that have claimed that plutonium actually gets better with age. Kind of like me or good wine. So anyway, but this is crucial to know. And in the PEIS, this perhaps in my view is the most egregious flaw. In the draft PEIS, NNSA simply states plutonium pits age. They do not back that up. They do not mention that there was an expert study in 2006 that I got then Senator Bingaman of New Mexico to require. But there was an expert study in 2006 that found that most pits, have minimum lives of over 100 years. Those that don't have clear fixes. A subsequent report reaffirmed that. And guess what? NNSA hasn't done a study since then. Has not released a full pit aging study since then. And you got to wonder why. And my answer is because they know it won't support them concerning pit aging. Okay? Now, the average age of pits is now around 43 years old, and there's already at least 15,000 existing pits sitting down at the Pantex plant near Amarillo. Astronomical costs. At least $60 billion over the next 20 years. The punchline is the Independent Government Accountability Office says NNSA has no credible cost estimates. And personally, I don't think that's out of negligence. I think that's out of design. I think if NNSA was forthright up front about the costs, Congress would have had very serious questions, but this is typical. Get a program, lowball it, get a program rolling, and then it gets very difficult to kill. In addition, pit production is so troubled that the Deputy Secretary of DOE ordered a special assessment of the program to be completed by mid-December. I have filed a Freedom of Information Act request for it. I know that others have. I know that Senator Elizabeth Warren and Congressman John Garamendi have asked for it, and it's still being covered up. We're not seeing it. There is a radioactive waste problem, and as a proud New Mexican, I am proud to report that my environment department is getting surprisingly strong. And this is, it is wonderful.
Yes.
And 8 years ago, my environment department sucked so bad that first name was Ryan, and I just kept calling him Lying Ryan. That was my name for the. Oh, this, I got Janice laughing. Well, one more quick thing. He resigned as Environment Secretary to become Executive Director of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association to lobby for. That's how bad it was. But anyway, nowadays, the New Mexico Environment Department is, God, they're amazing. And among other things, they are insisting that old legacy Cold War radioactive waste be buried at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which is in southern New Mexico, and so far is the world's only deep geologic dump for radioactive waste. But my environment department is, on DOE's butt. You must prioritize old waste. And NNSA explicitly states that new waste from pit production will be prioritized at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. And further, my great environment department is requiring DOE to start looking for a new out-of-state dump. And I did want to suggest Missouri. That would really get you guys going. Uh-oh.
No.
It's looking a little alarmed. But it'll be very politically controversial, and that's a big deal. Maybe about a decade ago, a senior NNSA official was quoted in a media article saying, WIP, and again, this is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, the dump. He said, WIP is the Achilles heel of pit production. So I say that just to emphasize how important this is. And if we can constipate the process, we might get some, okay? Now, there is limited existing pit production capability at Los Alamos. We lost that battle in 1996 when pit production got moved back to its place of origin, which after all was Los Alamos. But it was capped at 20 pits per year. So I'm trying to keep it capped. I really want to warn you about pit production at Savannah Riverside. Now, they're having incredible problems, incredible delays. So it's questionable if they ever will establish it there. But if they manage to do so, I'm being Cassandra in the wilderness here, it will end up being Rocky Flats light. It will start producing, plutonium pits, and, obviously this is my speculation, but I'm betting on a couple hundred a year for new designs for the new arms race. So we really need to beat pit production at the Savannah Riverside. Okay, another egregious thing. This bugs the hell out of me. The draft programmatic environmental impact statement. That's a direct quote. NNSA emissions are fully consistent with and support the U.S. commitment to the NPT. Now, I'm always in danger of taking too long. I'm sorry. It's a character flaw. But what's your name again? Anne mentioned her good friend Donna Constantine.
Yes.
So she joined, my organization, ANS, belongs to a nationwide Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. And so Donna accompanied us, and we're meeting with the head of the NNSA. And so Donna is a complete greenhorn. And the head of NNSA comes down to the lobby in the Forstall building on Independence Avenue to meet us. And the first thing he says is, we're all in favor of nuclear disarmament.
Okay.
It's only a question of timing. And then after that meeting, Donna said to me, I may be new to this stuff, but I think I know bullshit when I smell it. So that was Ann's predecessor. But, so I find it ironic, to have the PEIS make this claim as we speak, a review conference is underway at the United Nations. And it's held, these review conferences are held every 5 years. And for the third time, everybody pretty much assumes that this review conference will make zero progress towards nuclear disarmament. And in fact, we're going backwards. And the main reason we're going backwards is because these huge modernization programs and PIP reduction is actually the key issue. The Pentagon says so. PIP reduction is the key modernization issue. And what does modernization mean? I'll let you all quickly read that, but the punchline's at the bottom. Modernization means nuclear weapons forever. I want to emphasize production facilities expected to be operational until 2080, and the PEIS is explicit about that. It has a time range of 50 years for PIP production. So this is no flash in the pan. We are talking, nuclear weapons forever with active measures towards that end for the next half century. Now, and I'll kind of get ready to wrap up, but for starters, I grew up as a military kid, and so I don't know, somehow I've been fascinated with military things all my life. But the one-word rationale, and I remember being fed this as a kid, and then, throughout our entire lives, the one-word excuse, rationale, is always deterrence. We have nuclear weapons. It's always to deter the other from hitting us with nuclear weapons. Now, first of all, I would point out the historically inconvenient fact that the U.S. is the one and only to use atomic weapons thus far. And we have long engaged in threats to use nuclear weapons. Time and time again, we've done that. But we always have these high-level documents that explicitly state that it's all about deterrence. That's the fundamental reason. And then what follows the presidential nuclear posture review, the Pentagon takes its sweet time, typically takes about 2 years, but it comes out with what it calls an implementation plan of the president's nuclear posture review. And each and every time, the Pentagon explicitly rejects minimal deterrence in favor of what's called counterforce in nuclear weapons jargon. And counterforce is where you target the political leadership and the military assets of the adversary. And in other words, it's nuclear warfighting. That's what it is. And that is why we have thousands of nuclear weapons instead of, just a few hundred for minimal deterrence. And that's why we now have a $2 trillion so-called modernization program to keep nuclear weapons forever. And then so-called deterrence has a long and dangerous history of accidents and miscalculations. I want to especially recommend Daniel Ellsberg's doomsday machine. He, of course, is known for the Pentagon Papers. Not so well known is he was actually more concerned about nuclear weapons. And he was a nuclear weapons targeteer and policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. So I strongly recommend reading that book. And I'm starting to wind down, but part of my job is to try and scare y'all into action. I think it's pretty clear that the most dangerous 13 days in human history were during the Cuban Missile Crisis. October, was that 1962 or 63, I forget.
62.
But arguably, that's the most dangerous it's ever been. And the public doesn't know this, but there were somewhat similar situations over Berlin a couple of times. And then in 1983, Ronald Reagan made the Soviets really uptight. So that was another flash. But it, you know, things, I like saying it used to be a bipolar world, and pun intended. Bipolar meaning, you know, it was the U.S. and Soviet Union, but bipolar in the sense that it was crazy. And of course, mutually assured destruction or mad. It was freaking insane, is what it was. Things are far more complex now. You know, there's 9 nuclear weapons powers. That introduces a lot of variabilities. We have new weapons, cyber weapons, hypersonic weapons, increased danger of regional nuclear war. Are you all aware that a year ago, East Indian cruise missile went about 100 kilometers into Pakistan by mistake, a nuclear-capable cruise missile. And fortunately, the Pakistanis, I don't know why not, they didn't freak out. But I mean, it's pretty incredible. A cruise missile from, they are arch enemies. If you've ever been over there, they hate each other. And for an Indian cruise missile to actually straight into Pakistan, nuclear capable for 100 miles or so, oh. And finally, artificial intelligence. I urge you all to look up a study by King's College that came out about 2 months ago. King's College. It's in London, just like it sounds like it should be. It's King's College. So anyway, they did war games involving AI, and they found that 95% of the time AI went into escalation and started issuing nuclear threats. Now, you know, I fault mankind, and I put the emphasis on man instead of womankind. I fault mankind. It's always a race to the bottom. And so I'm afraid it's inevitable that we're going to use AI more and more in the command and control of nuclear weapons. And that'll scare the shit out of you. You know, I could rattle off 2 instances where mid-level Soviet commanders, through gut instinct, helped the world, more than helped, prevented nuclear Armageddon, just because of gut instinct. And if AI ever sidelines that, you know, who knows what might happen. Okay, you know, obviously I'm an activist, and part of my job is to encourage you all to be active. So this programmatic environmental impact statement is a good platform for that. It is, however, limited in time, of course, and NSA expects to, and I was told this by NSA officials last night, they expect to wrap this up sometime early next year. And we need to think in terms of, you know, continuing the fight. And we really, really need to do that. And so, you know, this is not just a flash in the pan. This is, you know, we got to play the long, long game in this one. So do be thinking about that. And I always want to end up, you know, or end with a little bit of a prep talk. And when there's not hundreds of people here, I like to end up citing Shakespeare and Henry V, and, you know, we brave few, we band of brothers, and I add sisters, but, you know, we brave few. And, you know, what we are doing is noble. This is noble work. And the way I view it is that we are attempting to preserve the opportunity for the human race to achieve full capacity or full enlightenment or, you know, whatever you want to call it. That is what our mission is, and it is honorable and good, and we need to go forth with determination and do it and use all of the available tools. So I started in writing, I stated this PEIS is an imperfect tool. I know that quite well. But it's what we got, it's at hand, it's on deck now. Let's use it to the maximum extent that we can. And then, after I prepared these slides and sent them today, I ran across one more, and this will be the last slide. But this is also, I tried to motivate you all in an uplifting sense. Now I'm going to try to motivate you in, what do I call it, a downlifting sense. But I had to make a connection in Charlotte, North Carolina, so I ran across this. While I was there in the airport. And so that is the Kansas City logo. Top left corner. So you can find this on the Kansas City website. And so U.S. stockpile milestones, and you see it goes all the way back to Fat Man and Little Boy, okay? But what I really, the reason I'm sticking this in for y'all of you is for the stuff on the right, under future, okay? And here we're talking, I'm using this to demonstrate that I and we don't pull things out of thin air when we're saying they're going to do new designs. There you go. That stuff on the right there. Those are completely new designs. Now, I can't expect you all to read it, and I'm having trouble. But the W93 is being designed now, okay? It's due to go into production in a couple of years. And oddly enough, I don't have time to explain it, but it's mostly for the United Kingdom. It's not even mostly for the U.S. It's mostly for the United Kingdom. Now, the other warheads that just have acronyms, first of all, the F in each case means future. But we don't even know what those warheads are. They're generic at this point. FSLW, SL is sub-launched, W is warhead. And the W93 is a sub-launched warhead. They're already talking about another sub-launched warhead. SS, what is that SS? Strategic something or another.
Supersonic.
FAW was air-launched. So, this is the first indication that I've had of 3 new design weapons beyond the W93, and Kansas City is very much going to be, I can't tell you how critical Kansas City, and this whole buildup on the American side for this new nuclear arms race would simply be impossible without Kansas City. And it's a shame that big fish got away. So I can stop it there, but thank you all for your time. And Q&A, right?
Yes. And we have some wonderful handouts from the Union of Concerned Scientists and from Nuke Watch, New Mexico, and we'll pass that out if somebody would volunteer to pass those out for me. And would anybody have any questions or comments to make? Please come to the step right up. And we also have a little, sort of flyer for you to fill out to let us know where you heard about this.
Okay, there's a gentleman.
Just go right ahead. Come
It's not really a question. I mean, it is a question, but it's not a question, I guess. What I'm wanting to ask is I went to Truman High School, growing up, so named after Harris Truman in Independence, Missouri. So I learned about basically the effects of nuclear weapons, as a young teenager, and I remember seeing the images of, not just nuclear shadows, the after effects of what's left behind from, versus being evaporated from nuclear weapon. We're also hearing stories and seeing the images of people who were affected by radiation poisoning. I don't know if you all have them, or if there's a way we could get them before tomorrow, but is there a way that we can get pictures of those, famous images of what are the effects of on people, what it looks like, that we can take it and we could show them, at the hearing tomorrow?
Yes, you can bring photos, you can bring banners, it's allowed.
Well, I'm asking, do you all have any printed out?
Yeah, well, I think Jane might have them at her house. Yeah, so we can ask her. We have lots of photos and lots of materials. Yes. Was there someone else that had their hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wondered about the relation between the U.S. nuclear program and Israel. And how much exchange, exchange of information.
Use the mic again.
I just wanted to ask about the relation between the U.S. nuclear program and Israel, the extent to which there's exchanges of information between the two.
Okay, the question was the relationship between U.S. and Israeli nuclear weapons. Now, for one thing, it's kind of interesting when you ask that question because there's a headline, recent headline that some Democratic Party members of Congress have written to the Trump administration saying basically come clean on it. Now, but to answer you specifically, there's not a direct relationship that I'm aware of. There's a very direct relationship between the United Kingdom and the U.S., but not Israel and the U.S., to my knowledge. But that said, the intelligence agencies between the two countries are deeply intertwined. But I should leave it at that. So.
I'm sorry, I got a question on the live stream. I'm going to ask y'all. My friend Quinn asked, was Kansas City involved in the development of Batman and Little Boy?
Involved in what?
The development of Batman and Little Boy, the nukes that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh, no, the Kansas City plant began in 1949, so it wasn't involved in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But probably we inherited or got this plant here in 1949 because Truman is from this area.
Right.
One interesting note that I saw on the Kansas City website, it's the only site that has had the same contractor ever since its beginning, and that's Honeywood. So, just an interesting note.
It used to be GE or Westinghouse.
And Bendix.
And Bendix.
And Allied Signal.
Allied Signal too.
You know, you're right. And I actually knew that. But they say that on the website.
They lie.
Say
They lie.
website. Yeah.
They mean the nuke plant has.
Maybe they're talking about the new one.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. I bet you that's it. But I'm sorry, I knew that. I knew it was called the Bendix.
Well,
So I guess I have two questions technically. The first one is, does the Department of Energy already have the money that they're requesting for the building of these pits? And the second one is, in the ideal world and for the benefit of the people of America, where would that money be better spent?
Okay, I'm repeating questions. It was, does DOE already have the money for pit production? Where would it be better spent? First of all, you probably know this, but appropriations are an annual affair. And so just a month ago, and this is for the entire government, the budget request came out for 2027. Now, what I can tell you, the 2027 request, and this is for both Savannah River and Los Alamos, is $4.9 billion, and it's going to be $5 billion for the next 6 years. So it's a lot of money. Now, where would it be better spent? Take your pick. I mean, in my part of the country, it'd be better spent in wildfire prevention. Across the entire country, it'd be better spent, as far as I'm concerned, on Medicaid, which they're cutting by $1 trillion. New Mexico, it's a very strange state. It's a very beautiful state, but I don't want you all to know that because it's crowded enough. But it limps along at the bottom of socioeconomic indicators. It is rated the lowest in child well-being and lowest in quality of education, but yet DOE spends $10 billion in the state of New Mexico every year. So what good does it do the average New Mexican? The same amount as the entire state budget, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think you ought to ask Chalice some questions. She's got degrees and I don't. So ask her stuff.
I might add also that the Kansas City plant budget for 2026, the actual one was over $1.5 billion. And for 2027, they are requesting over $2.1 billion. And the amount for plutonium pit production is over $55 million. So it's some hard cash.
Just to stack a little, that's about an 80% increase from previous year's ask.
Can you hear me? Yeah. My question is, in 3 minutes, you've given us so much information. How can we focus on in all of it? Where do we start? I feel like talking as a mother and a grandmother and a sister to my sister who died from cancer. I can't claim that it came from Rocky Flats, but she didn't live far from there. But she was also exposed to DDT as a teenager, marking our fields in Nebraska for the airplane sprayers. But, I just feel like talking to them as a person about how dangerous it is and how afraid I am. And is it okay to just speak from your heart and not try to do all the scientific stuff?
Yes, it's okay. Do it. But I would point out that one pager, that I wrote, and I was trying to be quite succinct on a relatively complex subject. So, if you're looking for main points to address in your comments, I just suggest that one pager. Now, Chanice is the person to ask about health impacts, etc.
But you have the degrees and the knowledge and the background, and we're just,
You're the experts. I told you you're an expert, and here you go, not trusting me. But no, I think, so the whole purpose of everything that I presented to you, those are all things I'll cover in my statement in 3 minutes. It's gonna be very quick, breathy whispers into a mic, okay? To get the point across. But that is not what moves decision makers, right? What moves people in the room and decision makers and media things is that personal story, that personal existence with these topics, right? So say there's something you're like, well, I'm kind of wondering, this is my experience, could that be related to this, right? And I can think of some statistics and things that it might be. Usually it's not gonna be a clean cut, oh, of course that was the result, you know? Now with berylliosis, it's beryllium, right? But yeah, I think it's so important. That's why usually when I give public comment trainings and things, I really stress the importance of your lived experience. So at the start of my statement, I'll talk about all my degrees and boring work stuff, but it's so important for community when you're in the area to be able to speak precisely as to why this is affecting you and why you're upset and why they need to do better. So yeah, you speaking as a grandmother and a local, that is the work. That is so important to everything that we're doing, right? And everything that y'all are gonna share about your lived experience and shared story, I'm hoping when I submit my gigantic report in writing, I can back up, I can say, by the way, in these comments, we're seeing this, and this relates to these studies and this and that. And so yeah, absolutely, we all have our role here, and they're slightly different, but yours is just as important, if not more.
Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you for the question.
I want to go back to the question, what would the money be better spent on? Because I thought of another thing that should be obvious. But at the hearing yesterday evening in Augusta, South Carolina, a grandmotherly-looking woman got up, to testify, and she started saying, "You don't get to cook until you clean the dishes," and I thought that was good. And what I mean by that, where would the money be better spent? And I'm going to use both Los Alamos and Kansas City as examples. It'd be better spent on cleanup. And with respect to Los Alamos, this is one example. There is, well, as you know, it's a fairly arid state and getting more so. And I just had the shittiest ski season that I've ever had. I've been skiing for more than 50 years, and I just had the lousiest season I've ever had. So that's a problem. But it's getting more and more arid, and Los Alamos lab has a huge groundwater contamination plume of chromium. And it's been known already for more than 20 years. And yet, the laboratory is so intent on producing new nuclear weapons, it still doesn't know how large this massive plume is of chromium contamination in our regional aquifer, which legally under EPA is a sole source aquifer. So, and to use the example of Kansas City, I wanted to stick in slides that I have. But 20 years ago, I found maps of the groundwater contamination at the old Bannister plant. So there's a very serious plume of volatile organics, solvents, and there's also a lot of PCBs in the groundwater under the old Bannister plant. So I submit to you, that is where the money should be spent. And it has the beauty of, we're actually talking about high-paying jobs that could go on for a couple of generations, at least in the case of Los Alamos lab. So I'm going to repeat what grandmother said, and that's what we ought to be telling DOE. You don't get to cook until you clean the dishes, so clean up your old mess before you start making more mess.
That kind of was my question. All of the numbers that I've been hearing floating around are, the budgets for the new weapons, but where is the budget for the cleanup of the old mess, let alone the new mess that they're projecting, right?
Exactly.
Do we have any numbers? Is anybody
Yeah.
talking about that?
We have numbers, but they're very slim.
The nationwide, the DOE program for cleanup is being cut by about 300 million. And I'd have to look for the exact budget figures. But cleanup is around 8 billion annually, and it's being cut. And so, listen, everything is essentially being cut except for the weapons activities. That's a budget category. It's called the weapons activities. In the case of Los Alamos Lab, it of course likes to project itself as one of the premier scientific institutions in the world, over which I would object. But science, with a capital S, that is a budget category. First of all, the science budget is only 80 million at Los Alamos, so it's puny. In fiscal 2027, Los Alamos is going to be $7 billion. But the 80 million science budget is being cut by half to 40 million. So basically everything's being cut. So is cleanup, so is non-proliferation. Renewables, completely eliminated. Research into renewables. So you see how it is with the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Well, we probably have time for one more question, so
I'll take one.
we're supposed to be out of here by 8:45, so I'm sorry.
I just heard about this today, about the hearing happening tomorrow, and I know nothing about nuclear stuff, but I thought I'd come and educate myself a little bit. So one of my questions is kind of like, what is the outcome we're hoping for tomorrow after the hearing? Is it to keep production where it's at with the current facility? Is it to like decrease production? What's the ideal outcome or goal?
Yeah, I mean, ideal goal would get rid of it all, right? I mean, that's my personal opinion. Let me not say that's necessarily UCS's. But certainly the goal, right, so is to first and foremost participate in our federally mandated and protected rights, which is to give back feedback on this and tell the government precisely what we think about it and demand that they do better, right? So that's certainly a first step. Ideally, we would get transparency. That's my main thing as the public health person. And then also a lot of the work that they're doing, even in the PEIS, they keep saying, well, this will only result in like an increase, 1 or 2 cases of cancer a year, which is ludicrous. I mean, if you're the 1 or 2 people with cancer every year, or the 50 people in 25 years, that's not okay. So we're also demanding that they actually do real statistics and real science and give us a real report. And all of these things are important because if they don't actually outline the risk correctly, we can't actually hold them accountable in the future for breaking precisely what they said they would do. So all of this, in a way, is the democratic process. In action. Absolutely. This is what democracy looks like. It's us showing up tomorrow and saying, this is what I think, and making sure that they actually stick to it. So then when they come up with their final decision in January, as Jay has told us before, so early and so often, if they don't respond to the comments correctly or appropriately, or if after they have released the final report and things go awry, we're all now open to sue them and say, hey, you said you were going to do this based on my report, based on my comment. You didn't actually address it, or you said you'd addressed it perfectly, and now 2 years in, you're completely messing up. And so that's a lot of the purpose of this, is literally just the due process that we are entitled to.
And then kind of in addition to that, I just want to ask real quick, like, if they don't care about the environmental impact or like the health impacts, is there anything we can do to impact like their financial bottom line, either decreasing their profits or making it like a pain in the ass for them to complete production?
First of all, I want to make clear that I'm bipartisan in that I condemn both political parties. So a pox on them both. Basically. But that said, You know, I've been going to Congress for 30 years, and when Republicans control Congress, it's very opaque. And I'm not exactly welcomed, I can tell you that. All of this leads to me saying, vote in the midterms, will you? It makes a real difference which party controls Congress. And there are a number of Democratic members of Congress, and I would specifically point to Senator Elizabeth Warren and then Congressman John Garamendi of California, that have raised very serious questions about pit production, have demanded the release of that special assessment that I mentioned, and they're not getting it. Now, they will get it if the Democrats regain control of Congress. But I quickly want to say again, a pox on both parties, because I know we're running out of time. We activists defeated every single major nuclear weapons proposal that George W. Bush came out with. Our luck stopped with Obama. When he made a deal to get the New START treaty ratified, he made a deal, and we've been losing politically ever since. So, but that's a long story.
And we have to run out, but I will say, always hold your elected officials accountable. I email, I go to their offices, I bug them each and every time I please, and do not be afraid to run for any sort of local office. We have to have as many people engaged in our democracy as possible to remain a democracy.
And let's have a huge applause for our wonderful speaker.